Another day of sunshine. April 16th, 2009, and we're inside looking out, but we're inside a wonderful building. Ann Smallman, how are you?
I'm wonderful, thank you very much.
I am so pleased to meet you today. Calvin and I have made the trip to Malone, to 51 Milwaukee Street, to the House of History. For a very good reason. We want to know history. 201 years now for Franklin County. We did a parade some time ago and we thought it might be a good idea to catch up on things. And we were trying to decide, Ann, before we started the camera, how long it's been since we were inside this building. And I'll bet you it's a decade.
Wow.
Time flies when you're having fun. Ted Mills was here and gave us the Cook's tour. And things look different outside now than they did.
That's right.
Whatever that was.
Probably 02.
You think?
Probably 02.
You think so?
Yeah, it would have been around the time they celebrated their history.
Well, it could be.
Yeah.
So maybe 7 years ago.
Yeah.
I exaggerated, but then I always exaggerate. So how are you?
We're great. We've got great things going on around here.
I think that's terrific. How come we've never met before? Have you been involved in history here for a long time?
I've been the director here at the Franklin County Historical Museum Society since 2004, mid-2004. So if you were here 7 years ago, then I wasn't here yet. I grew up in Malone, but my husband and I have only been back to the North Country for about 5 years.
You left us for a while.
We left for a while, yeah. We left for a good long while, but we're back.
Where did you live?
Oh, we lived in the South. We lived outside of D.C. for quite a while.
Did you really?
Yeah. So lots of places, but we're back.
This North Country is a magnet.
It is. It is.
And it must be good to come back.
It is. It's nice. We were in suburbia for a long time, and it wore us down. We had to come back home to kind of reconnect and
You have to
remember all things good. So.
Come back to the base.
That's
right?
right. That's right. That's right.
So have you always had a passion for history, or is that something that...
Oh, I have. I grew up in a nice nerdy history family. So
I love
when we
it.
took family vacations, we stopped at every historical marker and we went to historic sites.
That sounds familiar. My kids are out there watching this saying, yes, we did that.
Yeah. We complained as kids, but it obviously rubbed off on me, and I do. I love history.
So your parents were real history buffs too,
Yeah,
huh?
yeah, especially my father. Yeah, and took every opportunity to go to locks in Central New York on the Erie Canal.
Boy, here we go.
And living history museums and all kinds of places. So.
Did you ever make the Smithsonian when you were a kid?
Yeah, and I worked there for a time when we were in
Come
DC.
on, no kidding.
Yeah.
That's nirvana for me.
Yeah.
'Cause it's just such a magnificent...
One of the best parts of working for the Smithsonian was able to go behind the scenes because at my heart I'm a collections management girl, and so to go and work within the collections, which is what I did, and see the storage areas, the things that their collections are so large, like most museums, most of what you have doesn't make it on exhibit because there's not enough time or space to exhibit.
Like the iceberg, yeah.
Exactly. And it was just marvelous, just, kind of see and experience the tangible history of the country on this huge
So you studied this in college? Or
I did. I was a history major, a master's degree in museum studies. So
Wonderful.
It's my thing.
And then you came back home. And isn't it, the circle is complete.
It is. We're very pleased to be home. It was a good choice for us, and
Calvin has been doing this since the early 80s, and I joined him in 1997. And we spend a lot of time promoting the North Country, and to some outsiders it might seem trite. It might seem a little mundane, but to us it's our passion. We do live in a very special part of the world.
Yes, I agree.
And the history in Malone and Franklin County is kind of exciting. So you knew a lot of it before you came back.
Well, and not enough, because as into history buffs, it's never enough. You never can delve too deeply in the history. But when I came back, it was a joy to kind of immerse myself in Franklin County history.
This building, for the benefit of those people who didn't watch our show 7 years ago or whatever it was, dates back a long time, and there was a building before that and properties that date back to the
Well, this building was built 1864.
Yeah, Civil War era.
Yep, Civil War era. So it was a boom time in northern Franklin County.
Oh, yes.
And this house is evidence of that. It was built and right away sold. So our assumption is that it was built in order to, as an investment. And then it's had a succession of owners, the last of which was Bess Kirk, who actually grew up here as a child. And then when she got married, she and her husband lived here. And then she lived here until the early 1970s when her son sold the property to the Historical Society. And we've made it our home since then.
It's wonderful. And every county, every state have their own historical units. This society is different than some in the way it's been organized, but it's been a good one. And it's always had a lot of great support locally, hasn't it?
Yeah, it was. The Historical Society was first founded in 1903, so it has a nice long history itself as a society. And then in the mid part of the century, the membership kind of faded away, and then it was re-energized again in the 1960s. And since then has been strong. We have the annual historical journal, the Franklin Historical Review. We publish that annually. We have a strong membership base, not only locally, but of people who have some sort of tie to Franklin County, who want to support the history of Franklin County and its research and its presentation and its preservation. And so we have kind of a broad base of membership, which is nice to see. That
it is.
People still have that connection back with the area.
You have a newsletter.
We have a quarterly newsletter, and we have. This room used to be a research library with genealogy.
I remember last time there were books everywhere.
That's right. And we've moved all of those research materials out to the former carriage house, which has been renovated and is now the Schreier Center for Historical and Genealogical Research.
I was blown away when I saw the sign. I said, Calvin, that's not the barn anymore.
That's not the barn anymore. That's right. And so it's been renovated.
That's not your grandmother's barn. So when was that finished?
It was kind of a general process, and it's been up now for a couple of years, and we're kind of entering our second full year of being out there and open and available to the public. And we're going to actually be having some volunteer training for people who are interested in their own genealogy and would like to know how to research their own genealogy better, and maybe then would like to be volunteers helping other people research their own family history within our materials here. We're going to be doing that at the end of April. We don't have a date yet, but because genealogy is addictive, and once you kind of look at your own family history, sometimes you can't get enough.
Did you see that gleam in her eye when she said that? Genealogy.
That's right. It's addictive, and it's kind of the hunt and the detective work that goes into that, I think. And so we have most of our volunteers started out doing their own family history, and then just loved the research aspect so much that they're volunteers helping other people.
Is that your favorite part of it?
So for me, I actually did get obsessed with my own family genealogy for a while in grad school when I had the time and I was young enough to stay up late into the night looking things up. But I find it fascinating because that's where the personal kind of meets the historic, because you can look through census data and see the names and the dates and the information about the goods that people had and the places they lived and moved to, which is fascinating in and of itself. But when there's a personal element, when there's some sort of personal connection there, it's your family, it was your house that those people lived in, or something. There's something that kind of just adds an extra spark, and so I think that's a really kind of important way for people to kind of connect with history. Because if it's just something that happened to people, far away, either in time or place, it's kind of hard to make a personal connection. But when it has to do with your own bloodlines or your own larger family, it can be a magical connection there, and it really draws people in.
We spend a lot of time telling our viewers that it behooves us all to study where we came from.
Absolutely.
Where our country came from, where our counties came from, where our family came from. I'm making a trek to Ireland in October to visit the town where my ancestors lived during the potato famine.
Excellent.
And I think that's, like you said, it's a very personal thing.
Yeah.
My next question was going to be, why study history? And I think we've begun to answer it already, haven't we?
Absolutely. In addition to the personal connection, And you don't have to memorize dates, and you don't have, just to have a good sense of the history of your community helps anchor the community. And it doesn't see if your community is experiencing a little bit of economic woes, or there's a downturn, or if there's something that is not necessarily very positive in your community now. If your whole concept of your community is this present predicament, then it's easy to get lost and not see the benefits of your community. But when you can anchor your community in a stretch of time, and you can see where you are, where community is, where the people that you're amongst right now are in a kind of a continuum, the history that, people like you or unlike you in some way have lived and kind of breathed and sweated and toiled, and they've built this community from, for example, in Franklin County, out of what 202 years ago, was wilderness. And or if you're a member of the Akwesasne Nation, then your history stretches back in this area even further. And if you've got a sense of that history, then you're anchored more, and it doesn't seem so nebulous, and it doesn't seem so free-flowing. And to study your history, like I said, it doesn't have to be, essays and studying dates and time, but just to have a good sense of the people who came before and what they did, and how you are part of continuing that into the future. And people will look back and see you as part of that continuum, I think is important. And it helps us value where we are, helps us value where we live, and the people that we're kind of sharing this place with.
And doesn't it please you to be able to transfer your passion to young people?
I love that. And we have a Girl Scout troop coming to do a tour next week. These girls came as part of our fourth grade program. For 35 years, the Society has brought fourth graders from Franklin County through the museum and done a fourth grade program, spring and fall. Fourth grade is local history in New York State, of course. And these girls came through with their classes in the fourth grade, took the tour, did the hands-on activities, and they wanted to come back so eagerly that they're doing it as part of a Girl Scout tour. So it will go towards some of their Girl Scout badges. And to hear that warms my heart, because they've connected with their own history in a way that was exciting enough to them, as fourth grade girls, now fifth grade girls, that they really want to come back. And I think that's wonderful, because then that's kind of a spark, that's kind of a beginning, and a nugget, if you will, for hopefully some further exploration.
How many of their parents have never been in this building?
Actually, now after 35 years, we've got parents coming back as chaperones who were here in the fourth grade.
As little kids?
And I would say that of every fourth grade class that comes through, at least one of the chaperones chose to chaperone because they remember coming in the fourth grade.
See?
And they come back and they say, I remember we baked cookies too. And so,
I love it.
Because many of the things we do, baking of the cookies and the sometimes spinning, the weaving, that kind of thing, are the same hands-on crafts that we did with them when they were here in the fourth grade. And so, and they, had the glow on their face like a fourth grader all over again, because they're remembering when they were here, which is great.
You never decided to go into teaching? Did you teach at one point?
I did. Well, I was a substitute teacher for a while, but out of time and place and necessity and that kind of thing. I didn't, in part because my real heart is with the objects themselves and arranging them and describing them and preserving them and that kind of thing. But part of, I do get to teach a lot. I get to give tours.
Of course you do.
And I get
you are right now.
Yeah, and I get to talk on camera about all kinds of history things. And it's, and so I do get to do that part of it, but I also actually get to spend time with the old stuff.
Well, we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the history of Franklin County with Ann Smallman at the House of History in Malone. We'll be right back. Such a pleasure to be here with you, Ann, today. Let us go back to the beginning. 1808.
1808.
There was no county here before then.
That's right.
There were other adjacent counties, especially over Clinton County.
Yeah, and St. Lawrence County. On either side of us, east and west, were both formed much before Franklin County. And then in March 11th, 1808, Franklin County was broken off from Clinton County. Originally, all the land was kind of was just Chateauguay, like all of Franklin County, which had belonged to Clinton County. And March 11th, 1808, Franklin County was set off as a separate county. And interestingly enough, there are several counties within New York State with the same birthday, which means New York State legislature
no kidding.
must have just done a batch of these, counties petitioning to be their own counties.
Oh, yeah.
And so that must have been the day when the state set aside to kind of, okay, this is what we're going to do. Yes, them. And so it's a kind of a county. 2008 was a bicentennial year for lots of counties around New York State.
So we know there were Native Americans living here long before that.
Absolutely.
We know that some of these lands were settled before that.
Yep. In 1808, most of what's now Franklin County was wilderness. The St. Regis Mohawk natives had their settlement in northwest Franklin County, very near where the bounds of Akwesasne are now. And all of what's now Franklin County was hunting and fishing grounds, but not with native settlements in it. And so the first settlers that came into Franklin County and kind of carved out a living in the wilderness, so to speak, were from Vermont. Apparently Vermont was too crowded in the turn of the century, and they came across and settled first in what is now Chateauguay. The town of Chateauguay was founded in 1799, even before there was a Franklin County. So like I said, it was part of Clinton County. And then the northern third of Franklin County, the kind of the foothills of the Adirondacks, going down to the St. Lawrence River Valley Plain. That was what was settled first. And the first settlers came through. Malone was settled in 1808. It was surveyed and then settled in 1802. And then Malone was actually founded as a township, incorporated as a township in 1805. And so Chateauguay was the first incorporated township in Franklin County, and then Malone the second in 1805.
And Malone is now the county seat.
Malone has always been the county seat. Yes, Malone has always been the most populous since its founding, but just barely. Other townships kind of rivaled it for commercial importance. Fort Covington, of course, had steamboats on the river, and was really important as a trading post between Canada and the U.S. But then Malone has always been the most populous. It continues to be the most populous. Continues to be the county seat.
We got a huge board here, which was lying down when we came here. We kind of tipped it up so that north would be north.
North would be north, that's right.
And this map, if you will, was used during the bicentennial celebration. Maybe it was down at the fairgrounds.
That's right. When Franklin County celebrated its bicentennial in 2008, we had several events throughout the year. We had a Founders Day event when the legislators dressed in period costume, and that was cool. At the fairgrounds, or at the courthouse. And then on June 12th, we kind of had our bicentennial day. It was a big event. There was a parade, which you guys were at and filmed.
Yes, we were.
We held it at the Franklin County Fairgrounds in Malone, and there were historical exhibits from most of the townships in Malone. And there were Civil War reenactors, and there were fireworks and concerts. It was a wonderful day.
That was great.
Commemorating the bicentennial of Franklin County. And this was made by several of our members here at the Historical Society in an attempt. The outline is of the current boundaries of Franklin County, and then the current townships in Franklin County with their current names. And the kind of names at the top there with the buttons are names which in 1808 were proposed as township names for Franklin County. These were townships which were not settled in 1808. They were never incorporated with those names, but they were kind of proposed areas. And some of the big, huge townships that currently exist in Franklin County, like Santa Clara, like Waverly, like Harrietstown, were proposed in 1808 to be much smaller chunks, much resembling kind of the northern third size townships. But then when those areas failed to be settled in large numbers, even by the mid 1800s, they were kind of combined together and incorporated as larger areas. So that's why Santa Clara and Waverly. And
Look how big Santa Clara is.
it's huge.
Yeah, for people who have never seen a map with the counties, with all the towns delineated here in Franklin County. And Santa Clara, when I was a little boy here, a long, long time ago, was pretty desolate rural country. And guess what, folks? It still is.
And it never, the kind of boom years for population in the southern counties, in many cases, or southern townships, with the exception of Harrietstown, in which the Saranac Lake area kind of boomed with the pure cottages, but in Waverly and Tupper Lake and Santa Clara, lots of the boom times were when the logging camps were in full production, in full swing, and swelled with the workers and the people in the camp who took care of them.
It was a whole culture, wasn't it?
It was, and then when the logging operations kind of moved on, then those logging camps often completely ceased to exist. In some cases, became established townships, like the village of Tupper Lake. But they would swell when the logging was going on, and then go back down. And so,
I'm delighted we came here for many reasons, because I had never heard any of those names up there in my life, and didn't know that they were ever proposed.
Yeah, in fact, some of them can be tied to family members of the original land proprietors.
Yeah.
So, for example, the township of Duane is named after James Duane. He was the proprietor. He owned the entire part there. But some townships like Bombay are not named for a person, but then other ones that might have existed in a different kind of history, like Williamsville or Annastown, were named for people connected with them.
And thank goodness many of the people in these towns are passionate about history as you are. They
Absolutely.
celebrate their own centennials and bicentennials.
Absolutely.
I know that active group up in Westville, for example, and great people, and they really care about where they came from.
They are.
As many others do.
One of the things that we're delighted with here at the Franklin County Historical Society is that there are all of these local town historical societies that are just incorporating, that may have been active for several years, but now are actually have recognition as nonprofits themselves, and the people are just on fire for their local history, and that is exciting. That is wonderful. Like you said, in Westville and Constable, and many of these towns have their own either historians organizations or historical societies, depending on what they call themselves, and it means that where sometimes people might be reluctant to take their kind of treasured family artifacts or their kind of just their family stories, but that tell so much about the local history. But they might not think that, it's just our family story. And they might be reluctant to bring it to us as the County Historical Society, which is unfortunate because we would love to have those things, but sometimes they might be reluctant. Sometimes they see the local historical society, like the Westville Historical Association, for example, as a good repository for those things, or a good place to kind of share their family stories, which is wonderful because then they get preserved. And then the people who care so much about that local history are themselves preserving it and spreading it and making it known. And I just think it's wonderful.
We've spent a lot of time on this program, as often as we think we need to, in begging and cajoling people to look in their attics and their cellars. Photographs, handwritten family histories, which fill in the jigsaw puzzle for you and for other historians, because that anecdotal history, the family history and the skirmishes and the boundary line disputes and all those wonderful things, people with memories of the early school days, the first schools, for example, throughout Franklin County. Those things are so cool. Yeah. And if people would only think to get those archives out and share them
yes, absolutely.
with others, because they are important.
Absolutely.
They're all important.
Absolutely. And we have our annual historical journal accepts contributions from the community, from our members and people who perhaps found a cache of letters in their attic, from their grandmother to their grandfather, or it's a bill of sale for the piece of land they bought and adjoined to their property, and that kind of thing. And when joined with the family history, or when joined with some pictures of the house and the land and that kind of thing, make wonderful articles, because like you said, they fill in bits of the jigsaw. Because if we know about this area and this area, and we just need that little bit to connect them to make the full story known, that becomes invaluable. And you might think, oh, it's just my family. But your family is as much a part of the fabric of the history of Franklin County as any other family.
And the history of Franklin County is so darn colorful.
It is.
Many, many high points, but even during the low points, things were really happening around here.
Yeah.
There's so many historic places that I'm sure many people haven't visited. The Girl Scouts are a unique group. The fourth grade classes, we're so glad that they're focusing local history in fourth grade, and we think that should be expanded even more. But there are so many phases in the history of this county we want to cover, but I want to go back to the beginning and talk about some of the early growing pains. And after the county was incorporated, what happened?
Many townships themselves, because the population kind of increased exponentially. For example, the population in 1810 of Franklin County was less than 3,000.
Was it really?
But even so, was almost 3,000 people by 1810.
Yeah.
Which is 2 years after the incorporation of Franklin County, and 10 years after the first settlers started streaming in. So that's quite a population increase. But then from less than 3,000 in 1810 to 42,000 in 1900 is a huge growth. And then from 1900 to 2000, so another 100 years. The population went from 42,000 to 51,000. So the growth in Franklin County was in those early years. The population growth was in those early years. And as a result, townships were big. For example, Westville was broken off from Constable.
Oh, yes.
It was the western part of Constable, and so it became known as Westville. And so, Constable was larger and then broken up. The larger townships broke up. For example, Chateaugay was everything, and then Chateaugay became what it is now. And as population grew in some of these areas, they might decide it was too far to go to the town supervisor up in another part of the township if it was a big township, and so they broke it up, and so they became smaller and smaller. And so, from one census to another, you might have somebody, who originally their address was Constable. And the next census, they're in Westville. Well, they didn't move. It's just the designation of the township where they lived
That's
changed.
a good point that I haven't heard articulated before. And that's something for people to think about. Of course, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But it's something I hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, and people who'd settled in Chateaugay would have had a Clinton County designation until 1808 when Franklin County existed. For that matter, anywhere that was being settled.
What kind of written history do we have of the very early days of Franklin County? Are there some formal histories that people can look at?
There are three kind of major published histories that we kind of use as our default. We've got Franklin Huff. We've got Hurd, and then we've got
famous
Hurd, and then Seaver.
So here's Huff.
Yes, and I've got Huff and Seaver here. And Seaver was written in 1918, and he kind of looks all the way back
He does.
on 100+ years.
I'm going to have to get Seaver because I didn't realize.
Yep. And Seaver's all Franklin County, whereas Huff and Hurd incorporate both either Franklin and Clinton or Franklin and St. Lawrence.
Yeah.
They kind of...
So Hurd was a character all by himself, right?
Yep, and some of those early histories that were published about counties have sections with prominent men's photograph, or not, they weren't photographs, but they were engravings, reprinted, and with kind of a biography of the person. And in some cases, that's because for a fee, you could have your own biography and your business's put in as part of the place's biography
Hurd
to help pay
Hurd
for
was very good at that, and both Clinton and Franklin counties.
Yeah, help pay for the publication of the book. So you've got to take those kind of pieces with a grain of salt, but the history as a whole are usually pretty sound.
And I have to tell people that, photography came along a lot longer ago than people may realize. People think because of all of Brady's Civil War photographs that's when photography began. But photography was pretty well established by then. That's why all of his photographs are so beautiful.
Yes.
But there were photographs being taken of this area long before that. And this society is fortunate to have, I was going to say hundreds of thousands of photographs, but it is well over 200,000 different photographs of one kind or another, including several thousand of those wonderful glass plate.
Yeah. If you include negatives in our collection, we do have several 100,000 images.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, and we have a wonderful collection of glass plate negatives that
they're so exciting to me. I don't know about you.
Well, it's neat because even though they're glass, you'd think they're much more breakable, but they're very sturdy. They're quite thick.
The images are sometimes,
and as long as they've not, the emulsion, the image side is not stuck to something else, they'll adhere quite well to the glass. And we are about halfway through scanning our glass plate negative collection and putting them up online.
That's important for people to know that you're doing this, because it's one thing to have stacks and stacks of these glass plates, and another thing to have no way people can really access them.
Absolutely.
So now you digitize all of this stuff and explain that process to people, because we're doing the same in Clinton County.
Yeah. It's with the the widespread availability of digital media. It makes it possible to have access to these images in a way that simply wasn't possible before, because to just kind of go through them all presents occasion for damage to them. And then they are negatives, and you'd have to actually come here. But now we're in the process. We have a dedicated scanner and computer, and we are scanning these glass plate negatives. That's what we're doing first. The glass plate negative collection we've got came to us through Norbert Rubidoux, who was a local photographer, and he had acquired the.
Does that sound familiar, Calvin?
They had acquired the stock of previous photographers' negatives, and so he himself helped preserve several photographic studios' work.
Thank God for these local guys who did, and that's wonderful.
Yeah. So we're scanning these, and then we are making them available on our website. Our website, which is franklinhistory.org, has a link to these images.
Yes.
And you can see the ones we've already scanned, and you can go through them. Most of them have a date associated with them, 1918, 1912, that kind of thing. So you can, if you say, oh gosh, there was a William Smallman, in my family, I wonder if that's the one. Oh wait, my William Smallman would have been born in 1950, so an 1918 picture wouldn't have been the right one. Kind of helps you kind of place it, but yeah, and that way, from the comfort of your own, computer in your pajamas, you can kind of do some research and look at these things, and it increases the accessibility, which historical societies have been craving. We don't want things to be hidden away. We don't want them to be kind of secret and hidden away. We want people to be able to see them and experience them and learn from them, and again, connect them with their own personal history.
That's an excellent point, because part of my frustration in trying to perpetuate a passion for the history in our area and here and all the other places in northern New York is the fact that a lot of this stuff was not accessible to the masses. And these poor farm people were so busy trying to get the crops in and milk the cows, the last thing they thought was going down to the local museum. Well, I mean, this is true of our Kent the Lord House Museum in Plattsburgh and our other museums. But now, that kind of thing, there aren't very many homes that don't have a computer these days, and or, because they have kids and grandchildren, access to the internet. So we can spread the wealth.
That's right.
In ways that we could never do before.
Well, and especially because the Franklin County Historical Society is quite small. and I'm the only staff person, and I'm half-time,
Yeah, but
and we're volunteer-led.
You're as good as 20.
What is I like you can come over any day. You know, using the internet and technology to increase our accessibility is a wonderful tool for us, because we can't be open, 100 hours a week. We can't do things like that. Unfortunately, we would love to, but we can take the time we do have and kind of expand it tenfold by making things available on the internet, making things available to people where they're at, so they don't have to accommodate our availability for office.
Did you say you have grants for the pictures, for the scanning of the pictures?
New York State Council on the Arts actually funded the initial scanner purchase and computer purchase, and by which we began to scan the pictures and put them up online.
So who's doing it all?
We have volunteers and myself. We are scanning them and making them available. And it's a slow process because it takes about 7 minutes to scan a single one, save it, make a record for it, and upload it. So that's a slow process. And of course, you have to be very deliberate about how you handle them and store them. We put them in 4 flap negative enclosures and label the enclosure and put it in an acid-free box and put that again away.
We've always found when we show old pictures that come from people's private collections that just happen to appear, that it generates a lot of comment, because people will call up and say, "That's my grandmother's house. I grew up down the street. I know where that garage was." And so you get everybody involved in the process. And so you can do that same thing when they view your photographs on the internet.
Yeah,
they can scream at the screen and say,
"That's me, that's right." That's the same nose I inherited right there. Yeah, that's something that we are looking forward to is eventually having all of our print and negative collection available through a database online. It's a long time coming, but that's our goal. We'd also love to take some of our most used resources and make those available, because census data is available online already through other places. So the things that are unique to us, we're looking at ways to kind of put those up. Sometimes we've got business ledgers and sometimes day books. We have several of the country schools, the one-room schoolhouses. The directors of that school would meet once a year, and so we've got a book, and it'll cover 75 years worth of meetings, because it was 1 page each, and it was so-and-so's responsible for supplying the firewood for country school, district number 14.
6 chords, $3 a teacher.
Exactly.
$9.
That's right. And so they'll record those things, and we've got that, and it just kind of, and you can see how the price of things went up, and you can see the same names, sometimes the same names that exist in that area now, and they're just, those things like that are wonderful resources, and those are the things that are most able to put up online, and so that's kind of our plan to increase accessibility to our collections.
Wonderful. Bless you for doing all you do, because we know you don't make $4 million.
Not quite.
But there are rewards that you can't even begin to quantify.
Well,
for doing.
I love
what
it.
You do.
So.
How can you not? That's so obvious. What if people get copies of these books? They can find them in the library. They can find them here.
Yes,
for example.
absolutely. Yeah.
What kinds of things would they be reading here? I notice you put a yellow marker in this page.
Well, we're looking ahead to the bicentennial of the War of 1812. And so this is actually a marker I've got stuck in there.
Boy, are we looking forward to that, aren't we, huh? Because the Battle of Lake Champlain and Battle of Plattsburgh, September 11th, 1814.
Exactly.
When we started this, Calvin and I weren't sure we'd both be still partners by that time, but we were figuring who would push the wheelchair or the wheelbarrow, whichever works in that case. Well, I think we're going to make it, because we're getting closer and closer.
Well, you've got to make it. I mean, come on. That's such wonderful, and because it affords kind of a long exploration. For example, the bicentennial of the founding of Franklin County, we celebrated over the course of 1 year. I mean, it was founded on one day, but we celebrated over the course of 1 year. But the War of 1812 wasn't just 1 year. It wasn't just in 1812. Like you said, especially in this area, a lot of the things we'll be commemorating happened through 1814.
Many of our people up in Clinton County are so parochial in their study of history, because there's so much locally, they fail to take into consideration that Franklin County was very much involved.
Yeah, Malone was occupied by the British forces.
Of course.
Yeah. Yep.
and Fort Covington, and there's so many places that were involved.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. There's so much history here. So what other salient facts would you like to bring up in coming through the timeline of the history of this county?
Let's see.
War of 1812 is very, very important.
Yep, and that's coming up. So we're kind of starting to focus on War of 1812 things and kind of remind people. In some ways, it's kind of the lost war. It was kind of the way in which America cemented its revolution.
Oh, yes.
But then in this area, because no battles of the Civil War, American Civil War, were fought in Franklin County, some people might have a tendency to think, oh, that was there, that was in the South, that was in the Mid-Atlantic, it was in Pennsylvania, not in northern New York. But there were drafts, there were conscriptions, there were lots and lots and lots of locals who went to fight in the Civil War. There were even some people who went and fought for the Confederacy.
Oh, yes.
Obviously weighted in favor of the Union, but there were some people who fought in favor of the Confederacy. And there's even a story of a township in northern Franklin County where several of the men raised a Confederate flag in the town.
I did not know that.
And then there were men from Malone who took exception to that and
picture that. Yeah.
and decided to go make them forcibly take it down. And before those people got there, someone else rode ahead and said, "Look, you might want to think about this a little more because you're surrounded by Union men and might not be a good idea." And kind of a big set to was avoided because they did take it down. But it was such a heightened, it was so tense everywhere, even in the North Country, during the American Civil War. And kind of as one of the results of the American Civil War was the way in which farmers and laborers became soldiers, and they were trained in the use of weaponry for more than just hunting. And the Fenian raids of 1866 and 1870. Locally, there were Fenian raids more than just in northern Franklin County, in Buffalo and in other places along the Canadian border. But here in Franklin County, we remember in 1866 and 1870, they were both failed, attempted invasions and captures of Canada by the Fenian Brotherhood, who were Irish, kind of equivalent of Irish Republican Army, kind of freedom fighters, rebels. The plan was, these were members of the Fenian Brotherhood who wanted to compel Great Britain to give up their occupation of Ireland. And so their plan was they would invade Canada, which was still part of the Dominion, still part of the United Kingdom. And at that point, and they were going to compel Britain to trade Ireland for Canada. So the Fenian Brotherhood were going to invade Canada and ask for a switch, hold Canada hostage, and say, get out of Ireland and we'll let Canada go. And so in 1866, it failed. And then there was enough support for this idea that, again, 4 years later, Fenians massed in northern Franklin County on the border with Canada. They were armed. They took the trains up. They weren't secret about their activities. In 1866, they kind of just popped up all along the towns along the border. But then in many cases, they just rode the trains with their weapons, rode up right to the border, and they kind of encamped and treated it as kind of wartime. And in many cases, kind of overrode the civilians around them and just camped out in people's fields and that kind of thing. They were both repelled. Neither were successful. And as a result, sometimes farmers still turn up, pieces of uniforms or pieces of guns, that kind of thing, in their fields right along the border.
That's neat, because that same thing happens almost everywhere.
Yeah.
But isn't it wonderful when we talk to a man who's very interested in the native populations in the Clinton County, and his family have been involved in truck farming and so on through the years. And as a little boy, he would follow the plows and pick up the pottery artifacts and the weaponry and the buttons and so that's so cool but that's all part of it. Now, I'm guessing from listening to you talk for the last few minutes that you're really interested in that Civil War era part of the history here in Franklin County. Is that your main focus for you personally?
It's not. It's just one piece of all the good bits that make up the
It's
history.
very interesting. The early days of Franklin County. You think about, transportation has everything to do with how an area develops, and railroads, of course, later on. And you've already mentioned the railroads, extremely important when the railroads went through the area. Mm-hmm. But before that, it was mostly rural and was mostly logging and hunting and fishing, and things weren't as connected until much later on. Absolutely. So let's go back to the first, let's say, 30 or 40 years of Franklin County and describe what life was like.
Well, you can imagine if you you came into either by homesteading or purchase a plot of land that was almost entirely wooded. In order to make a space to carve out a life, you chop down the trees to make a space, exactly. And then with those trees, you build your house. And you might build another structure to keep the animal or two you brought with you, or that once you had a place for them, you'd go back to Vermont and bring them back with you. And then every year you clear more land. You chop down more trees, you burn down the stumps. When there were more trees than you could use, you would burn the trees, and you would sell the product as potash. Potash was leached down to make lye.
Right.
And it was a huge cash crop, if you would, at a time when it was almost all barter and it was almost all subsistence. This was actually something that you could dry out and package up in bales, and you could actually take back where there were merchants and traders and sell them. People needed the lye for lots of things, for soap, for lots of things. And when you've got a ton of trees that you're chopping down to burn, because what you want is the cleared land, you will be, why not burn down, why not burn up all the wood and create, potash and sell it. And then that infuses badly needed cash. Or you could trade the potash for the things you needed, for the iron skillets, for the tin candle molds, for the halters and everything else for your animals, and for the things you can't make yourself. You take what you can and you trade them for something else. And so potash was a huge business locally. As land became cleared, people obviously turned to farming for subsistence, for things themselves. Once pasture land got established, they would raise sheep and use the wool for themselves. Once dairy farming became a possibility with enough cleared land, people would sell their milk to the cities. So then when the railroads did come through, the price of milk soared because they could get their milk quickly to New York City, which made all the difference, because fresh milk in those days was highly prized. The quicker you could get it, the higher the price. But before that, you've got the roads that are cut through the wilderness that are not paved, they are not maintained, they are the old corduroy roads in other words, you might lay logs down and fill them in with dirt just to keep them from being mud.
A lot of the bigger roads were military roads and corduroy roads, and made from logs and whatever they could do to get through.
Yeah, and so they were exceptionally rough.
Yeah. But the interesting part of it is that many of those roads are still followed today by our modern roads are still on those paths, like the old military turnpike and the military roads all the way down through. Isn't it amazing?
Yeah, Route 11 through Franklin County follows the same roads that were originally established, and some roads were pushed through and joined kind of smaller roads and made straighter and gone through farmers' fields. But in many cases, they follow the same general route. And to go an hour between Plattsburgh and Malone today was a day's journey. before, when the roads were
So
horrible.
potash was an industry. What other industries early on?
One of the early cash crops was hops. Was the growing and raising
yes.
of hops. Hops, of course, is used to make beer, and Franklin County at one time, during one year, had the single greatest yield of hops in the nation. And was always consistently up there among all the
There are less
hop-growing
hops
regions.
now, aren't there?
The hops prices in the 1900s took a nosedive as people started buying foreign hops, and the different kind of varieties of hops, other varieties of hops that weren't grown as easily here, came into favor. And then in the Midwest, they started growing the hops.
Yeah, because I remember even in the 1940s and very early 1950s, there were still lots of hops fields around here, especially in the 1940s.
Yes.
So isn't that amazing? All right. How about mining?
Well, let's see. In the mid 1800s, the Lion Mountain mining began, and was a huge iron deposit there, which is right kind of in on the border between Clinton County and Franklin County, in eastern Franklin County, and there are all kinds of small caches of deposits, but there of different things. But iron was the major thing that was mined, and then often smelted right there. The Catalan forges in some areas are kind of decrepit, but you can walk back in the woods in the middle of nowhere and still see them existing.
A separate piece of history that's so vital, isn't it, to this whole North Country?
Yeah, and it's great. That's kind of a hidden history, because lots of people know about growing hops, because everyone would kind of go and take 2 days during the hop harvest, and kids would leave school, and you'd go and you'd harvest the hops, and they can remember seeing the hop vines drying on poles stacked like teepees in the fields, and that's kind of a more recent history to people. Whereas the mining history is kind of much more hidden, because many of these forges and mining operations were in their location, were only in operation for a few years. And before the railroads came through, there was no way to get those, from the heart of wherever they were, in a meaningful way to their markets. And so it's probably the Lion Mountain mine that's the best known and had affected the kind of Chateauguay area.
You can't overestimate the value of getting railroads.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
all over the North Country, especially here.
Yeah, exactly. And in 1850, what became the Rutland Railroad eventually, which is how most people know it, but it was originally the Northern Railroad, was cut east-west through Franklin County. It came through Malone. And it became a shot in the arm, a boost. This area that was already beginning to thrive just took off. And so you see from 1850, especially through Malone, you see houses such as this one being built in a grand style, and fortunes were being made. And you can still see all the original log homes were being replaced with brick and stone and milled lumber homes. You can see storefronts that still exist that date from 1850 and on, mostly towards the 1880s. But when the second railroad was cut through north-south through Franklin County, that was Hurd's Railroad. Just when you have access to markets and people have access to you, through the railroads, when you can go faster and cleaner and neater and not bumpy, it opens up the area in a way that, in a similar way to the way technology is opening up the North Country, and kind of cutting away its geographic isolation from the rest of the state, and can create all kinds of opportunities. And the railroads did that for Franklin County. It was via the railroads that tourists came into southern Franklin County and made the Adirondacks the kind of vacation playground that it became, that brought tuberculosis patients up to take the cure in Saranac Lake.
Absolutely.
And it was the railroads that enabled people to move in ways that didn't mean they were always going to be in the same town their entire lives.
Well, Franklin County's always had a lot of attraction for tourists. In the early days, for hunters and people who love to come here via railroad or any other way they could get here, including some pretty famous people down through the years who loved to come up here, and they built the giant Adirondack great camps and the hunting and fishing, and you know there's a whole section of history just connected with the Adirondack region, and you know those huge log camps.
Yes.
A few of which still survive, and unfortunately most of them are going to rack and ruin these days.
Unfortunately, yeah, Sagamore and
boy.
White Pine Camp, and some of them still exist. But the enormous fortunes that it took to upkeep such, such huge structures in the wilderness, aren't possible for the vast majority of people. But the ones that have been preserved are just magnificent, because while they kind of reflect the Adirondack vernacular of log and birch bark and nature, incorporated into the architecture of the home, in other ways they so far surpass the simple camps that we all have tucked into the woods and on lakes and rivers, and so much closely mirror the mansions of the Vanderbilts and such. That it just kind of blows your mind when you see them. In one way, yes, they're kind of humble in nature, inspired. Another way, they are magnificent with huge chandeliers and 20 bedrooms. And so they're kind of a unique kind of. They capture the imagination.
We think of the frontiers being only to the west back in the 19th century, the 1800s and early 1900s, but we had a lot of frontiers here in the Adirondack region, and there were a lot of areas that were still unexplored. There's still some pretty remote areas of the Adirondack regions that people haven't visited yet.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of lore connected with the Adirondacks, and a lot of attraction for people from the big cities who love to come up here and spend a few days or a few weeks, and so we did bring a lot of tourists here.
Well, it's, the area of Franklin County, much of it was part of tracts set aside for Revolutionary War veterans.
Oh, absolutely.
So as part of their payment and their thanks for their service as soldiers in the Revolutionary War, big parts of Franklin County were set aside. Look, if you're a Revolutionary War soldier and you're entitled to one of these tracts, you can have it for free if you come and settle it. And not a single veteran took up the state on their offer, and so then it was sold to private land speculators. But it was in part because of the remoteness, and because it wasn't settled land. They would have had to have carved out a living for themselves from the wilderness. And there are wonderful tracts in the Adirondacks that are still absolutely wild. And everybody climbs the high peaks, and those are well trod and well worn. But there are ones just as magnificent, just a little lower, that are absolutely unexplored and wild. And people from outside the area come here all the time for that purpose, and they're in our backyard.
Nature's bounties right here.
Absolutely.
And we're in a beautiful part of town here in Malone today, and I would urge our viewers to make a trip to come and visit Ann Smallman and the other people. Maybe you can come the same day the Girl Scouts are here and be inspired by young people. But this place it's 51 Milwaukee, right?
Yes. Yep. One block off Main Street.
Just turn at the Congregational Church, and which has tremendous history all by itself, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. The First Congregational Church of Malone is the oldest church in Franklin County, both in congregation and in building. And the first resident pastor in Franklin County was the first pastor, Ashbel Parmalee, of the Congregational Church. The church itself is 202 years old. It is currently its third church building of the congregation on the same site, right there in Main Street.
Talk about building on the foundations. We use that metaphorically, but it is built on foundations, and there are secret tunnels and rooms and passageways down underneath that church that are so intriguing to me.
Right. The first building was built in the 1820s. The second building was built in 1851. And then that church building, the second church building, built in 1851, they call the Red Brick Church, was built with a false room in its basement that was accessible only through a tunnel in the floor of the basement that popped up then inside.
How many of our viewers know that? Yeah. That's truly exciting.
And the tunnel was built, the false room was built to secret escaping slaves. So enslaved persons who were seeking their freedom in Canada, because by then the fugitive slave law had been passed, mm-hmm. which meant that former slaves, even once they reached abolition states in which there was no slavery and had not been for a couple of decades, they still could be sought by slave hunters and taken back as fugitives from the law. And so that's the point when escaping persons needed to make it all the way to Canada, which would require places as far north as the North Country to have stops in the Underground Railroad. And this tunnel, which existed in this basement of this second church building, the current church building, which was built in 1883, was built on the foundations of that second church building. One of the tunnels still exists, and the room, which was roughly underneath the front steps which went up of the second church building, now is kind of under the what we call the narthex of the current church building, and it is open now to the rest of the basement. But you can see the brick pillars and supports, and the tunnel. One opening is in the main part of the basement, and the other opening is within this, which was once a secreted room, and now is open to the rest of the basement.
And when you look at it, how can you not feel that history?
Well, and in thinking now, in the safety and contentment and full bellies of our own lives, to see this tunnel and say, oh, neat, you could crawl through this tunnel and pop up over there. But when you consider that what would drive somebody in a strange place, in a dark basement of a church, to crawl through this tiny little tunnel in the basement when you don't know where the other side is, you've not seen where it pops out, yeah. There's no electric light at the other end, to crawl through it and trust these people who are saying that they will keep you safe, to crawl through a tunnel and trust that there's another opening on the other side in a place that will keep you safe, and then to stay there for an indeterminate amount of time until it's safe again, and then come back out again and leave for Canada.
Interesting part of our history, there are church records which confirm that was a stop for the Underground Railroad.
Well, we've got large members of the congregation at the time, and all the way from the 1820s, who were founding members and then continuing members of the Anti-Slavery Society of Malone. The first three, I believe, pastors of the First Congregational Church were members of the Malone Anti-Slavery Society. Former members of the congregation, like John Dimmick, went on to be well-known members who secreted slaves, runaway slaves, for example, in their hay wagons, and would dash across the border. And there is a continual oral history within the congregation of the Congregational Church that ties its members and its building to Underground Railroad activities. And that is something which we are justifiably proud of in Malone, to have this history, both there and in the Dimmick House, which is now on Route 37. And then also the members of the congregation to feel proud of that ongoing history. And there's many places in Fort Covington which share a history as well. One house of which is currently being renovated and preserved, and the owners have an eye to preserving that.
Isn't that wonderful?
That history, and which I'm grateful for, because just the work of historical societies isn't enough. When private citizens themselves put their time and their energy and their money into preserving places that have this tie with history, and with sharing that history with their neighbors and with everybody else, and making sure that their children and grandchildren will have a site that they can look to and point to and visit. It's just, it's important, it's invaluable.
There are many more, and some which are undiscovered until now. Obviously, it wasn't something that was that was well publicized at the time.
It was illegal. These people were breaking the
illegal.
law, who were helping secret slaves. And so they did it from the conviction that the law was
And
wrong.
there's John Brown on the other end of the scheme.
That's right. That's right. In the southern part of the county, and then across the county line, we've got Timbuktu and the John Brown farm.
That's another thing, and you'll have to explain that, because I'm sure many of our viewers have no idea, except as a word, what Timbuktu means to the North Country.
Yeah, it was planned to be a community of self-supporting, newly freed people or escaped slaves, people who would form a community that was viable and visible, that they would be farmers and that they would have a community, and it was called Timbuktu. Unfortunately, it didn't flourish in quite the way that the founders had envisioned, but it spoke well of the entire North Country and Adirondack region, that it was an area that was anti-slavery, that was abolition, and welcomed the idea that people who had formerly been in slavery needed a way to start a new life and be self-sufficient, and be farmers in our midst. And when John Brown made his raid, and it was a failed raid, and then was imprisoned and executed, that kind of put an end to that. But there was most of the North Country was anti-slavery, and there were, of course, pockets which weren't. The early landowner of what is now Malone, Harrison, owned a couple of slaves initially. Yes. But from the records and all we can find, we can only identify, I believe, 3 slaves in Franklin County having been resident here. And that was in the very early years.
And unfortunately, census records don't allow us to identify many of these people who were slaves, because they were very often not even named.
Yes, just identified as a slave, 3 years old or 25 years old.
That was difficult for Timbuktu and all the other areas, for example. We can identify our own ancestors pretty well.
Yeah, it's unfortunate when the record keepers didn't see fit at the time to elicit names and birthplaces, because they saw these people as property.
Slaves were property.
And not to be enumerated as separate individuals.
And when I said interesting parts of our history,
sometimes they're not very pleasant.
Yeah, sometimes they're not pleasant, but they are part of history.
They absolutely are.
They should be studied so that we learn our lessons,
that's right,
so to speak.
Yeah.
What other periods in Franklin County history do you find interesting that you think we ought to talk about today?
Let's see. We've covered the introduction of the railroads and the craziness of the Fenian raids era.
That's all good stuff too.
And we have a really, obviously, long association with agriculture in Franklin County, the northern third, especially of the county, which was established as farming communities, and then tying into the logging history and that kind of thing. The Franklin County Fair has been in Malone for over 150 years.
Yeah, these were and are agricultural fairs.
Exactly. And at the fairgrounds, which are here in Malone as the county seat, still say the Franklin County Agricultural Society over the gates. Of course, those of you who are Laura Ingalls Wilder and Little House on the Prairie fans and have read Farmer Boy, which is, of course, the story of her husband Almanzo's upbringing here in Malone, right in the Malone-Burke line. In the Farmer Boy book, she recounts Almanzo's trip to the Franklin County Fair, and where he won a blue ribbon for his pumpkin, and he remembers the races, and we still have a racetrack, and we still have a grandstand, and there are still judging of poultry, of cows, of flower arrangements, of vegetables, of jars of preserves. There are still all those things that are tied in with the early agricultural roots of Franklin County, the continuing history of agriculture in Franklin County. It's not a dead history. It's an ongoing living history of agriculture.
Aren't you delighted with what they've done up there?
Oh, yes.
Farm?
Oh, absolutely. The Almanzo and Laura Ingalls Wilder Association have not only preserved Almanzo's boyhood home, they have renovated it and they have made it open to the public. They have rebuilt the barns. They are in the process of raising money to rebuild a school, although there was not a school on the property there, because going to school figures so prominently in the Farmer Boy story. They would like to recreate that one-room schoolhouse experience that Almanzo recounts. So they're raising money currently for that. And they're gonna rebuild that.
That's gonna happen.
And they just, in concert with Dean Butler, who played Almanzo in this series, which is historically inaccurate, but we won't touch on that. But the television series. But he came and he did some filming, and now there's a DVD, which is a wonderful thing. And for your relatives who want to come and visit and then take something home with them. And so that's a way, although it's kind of helping recreate a fictional account of Almanzo's boyhood, that account was based on his actual life.
Whatever works.
And really the way things, things happened. And it's a good snapshot because of a farm boy's upbringing. Because unfortunately, sometimes what gets preserved is the fine things and the beautiful houses, and the ones with the great molding in the ceiling, and the things which were workaday, and the things which got used until they get used up. And sometimes, the workspaces and farmhouses don't get preserved. And because that got preserved, it's kind of a living history in our midst. And for anyone who's not visited the Wilder Farm, they're open all summer long.
It's
and they
pleasant
give tours.
for Calvin and myself because we've done two complete documentaries down there, watching the progress. Because when I first moved back up here after being away like you were for many years, came back in the early 60s, I knew of the place, and there was nothing there to see except that, like your father, all my kids get in the car, we're going down to look at the homestead, and they get there and say,
it's a house. That's
your
right.
point is,
that's right.
But now we can see it today, and we're so pleased with what they're doing.
And it's the dedication of volunteers who have a heart for preserving history and making it known in Franklin County that make things like that possible.
And that happens. Are you recruiting members here all the time?
Absolutely. Members, volunteers. Next week is National Volunteer Appreciation Week, and we appreciate our volunteers all year round, and especially recognize them next week for the ways in which they make this place possible.
Now we're doing this. We should remind our audience, because this will be shown far into the future. We're doing this on the 16th of April, 2009. Beautiful sunny day. There's hope.
Spring is arriving.
Spring has sprung. But it is, volunteer spirit is alive and well in the North Country, and yes. I think we are a good example for the rest of the world. Yeah. They would do well to look at how many people, busy people who spend time helping you out.
Yep. I came, before we moved back to the North Country, my family was living in suburban D.C., in the Maryland suburbs of D.C., and there was not, although people, it was a transient era, but people do have a sense of place there. I won't want to insinuate that they don't, but there's a reliance on paid staff, and there's a reliance on people who do it for a living, and which is what I do. This is my vocation. But here we have people who give of their extra time and their free time to make things happen, and which makes you kind of you put more heart into it. When you're giving of yourself in a way, just because it's something you love, and just because volunteering is something you find to be important in your community, which is why we appreciate our volunteers so much. We would not be possible without our volunteer board members and our supporting members, both locally and from away, and it's vital. It's just necessary.
One thing comes to mind, because it happens to be a favorite subject of mine, is ghost towns. In Clinton County, we have many, many ghost towns. You've already alluded to the fact that populations change, centers of industry move. And so these, what once were thriving communities 100, 120 years ago, are now just a little foundation here or there in the woods, and we call them ghost towns. But that's very interesting, because you have many here in Clinton County, and it's fun to walk in the woods. another thing was a favorite exercise for our family. Look for the old foundations. Look where the lilac bush was and know that that's where something else happened. And see if you can find the old privy holes and, you know, that's a cool
It is. I mean, you've got communities that now are small hamlets.
Yeah.
Communities like Scary, which don't have a
One
very...
of my favorite places in the whole world.
Really?
Oh, yes.
It really doesn't have a large population, but because it's kind of a...
heard of Scary outside this area.
Right. It's a smaller version of its former larger self.
Oh, yeah. So that's so ghost towns are great, and it is fun to discover. You can discover history that way.
Yeah. Like you said, walk in the woods. And you'll see places in which there were barns, there were stone walls, which seemingly are dividing nothing, but once were dividing land from land.
And we've had quite a few famous people who lived and worked, sometimes their whole lifetimes, and sometimes for only short periods of time here in Franklin County.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
We did a story, for example, once on Orville Gibson.
Yes.
Of the Gibson guitar and mandolin fame.
Yep, and he's buried in Morningside.
Right Malone.
Yep. Yeah, we have Orville Gibson is kind of one of our hidden celebrities in Franklin County. Probably the one that people know the best is William Wheeler.
Of course.
Who was, he was born about 11 years after Franklin County itself was founded. So, his family was one of the first the pioneers of Franklin County. And he was born in Malone and he was raised in Malone. Other than a short stint at the University of Vermont, his family could not afford it. His father had died when he was young. And so he couldn't afford both tuition and to eat. And so he came back and he studied law with a lawyer, which you could do then. You didn't necessarily have to get your law degree at a university. He was district attorney of Franklin County. He was a trustee for the railroad when it was in receivership. And got it back on its feet. He was in the state. He was a state representative. He was a congressman, and then he was vice president of the United States under Rutherford B. Hayes. They were elected in 1876 in a much contested election,
boy.
much like our one 10 years ago here, which had to be settled by the courts. Hayes and Wheeler's election had to be settled because votes from Louisiana were seen as suspect. This was in Reconstruction period after the Civil War. The country was trying to build itself back together. The Union was trying to knit itself back together to be a cohesive whole. And in and amongst that turmoil, 10 years after the Civil War ended, William Wheeler was elected to the vice presidency. He was seen as kind of a steady, calm, not contentious character. He was part of the new Republican Party. The Republican Party was a new party, and he joined that. It was an anti-slavery party. William Wheeler was a member of the Malone Anti-Slavery Society, had been, and he was a very calm, reasonable man, and was seen as kind of a compromise candidate who would be fair, which was very important because during Reconstruction, there was so much partisanship. It makes our politics look quite tame and reasonable these days. But they eventually were sworn in. Their inauguration was months after it was supposed to be in 1877. Yes. And he served one term, came back to Malone, and lived another 10 years. His wife died just before he moved down to Washington, D.C. And so he spent his time in Washington, D.C. as a bachelor, as vice president. He was a member of the building committee of the current Congregational Church. He was a member of the First Congregational Church in Malone, and was on the building committee of the current building, which is the third building. And there's a pew dedicated to him with a little plaque that says Vice President William A. Wheeler Pew.
I love it. No kidding. Yep. I did not know that.
He paid in the front of that church. There is a giant marble cenotaph on the wall that says, in memory of Ashbel Parmalee, the first pastor of Franklin County, the first pastor of the First Congregational Church. And it has interesting wording. It says, he was instantaneously translated into the heavenly kingdom on this date. Most of us just get to say he died. But his says he was instantaneously translated into the heavenly kingdom. It's a funny kind of phrasing. But it's giants in the front of that sanctuary, and William Wheeler paid to have that put up. So he was a member of that. But in his will, when he died, he left money to all the churches in Malone. So he was a supporter of the whole area and interested in supporting the entire area and was a booster for northern Franklin County.
Yeah, there were some other pretty famous and some infamous politicians here in Franklin County. It was the county seat, so there were some pretty famous trials.
That's right,
held
Dutch
right here.
Schultz,
Oh, yes.
the beer baron of New York
Oh,
City,
yes.
a bootlegger and smuggler during Prohibition, and kind of a dangerous guy.
Oh, yeah.
Stood trial here because the prosecutors wanted to remove him from New York City, where they
Change the
figured,
venue,
that's
yeah.
right, figured that there was no way they could get a fair trial, and he was put on trial in Franklin County, and he stayed at the Flanagan Hotel, and he went to the Franklin County Fair, and he was seen in the company of local politicians,
Oh, yes.
and he was acquitted.
This is a great story all by itself.
Yeah, and whether or not he got a fair trial is up for grabs, and we could discuss that at length. But the citizens of Franklin County and that jury saw fit to acquit him. He didn't live long after that, though, and his legacy kind of faded away. But at the time, he was considered a mobster, and he was.
There aren't very many people of any age who haven't at least heard
the name of Dutch Schultz and know that was kind of a 9 days wonder here in northern Franklin County.
We're going to continue our wonderful conversation with Ann Smallman in just a moment. We have about 10 minutes left and so much to talk about, but I think we can cram it in. And just looking up at this map and another map you brought out of Franklin County, let's just talk for a second about its boundaries. Of course, it's Canada to the north.
That's right.
St. Lawrence County to the west. And
That's
St.
right.
Lawrence County is a monstrous
It's a huge county.
Goes all the way down. On the bottom, we have Hamilton County and Essex County.
Yeah.
And on the east,
Essex borders here, and then all the way from Franklin, the town of Franklin, north to the east of Franklin County is Clinton County.
now we talked about when the county was formed. Let's talk a little bit about when the towns were formed and give us some dates.
Absolutely. The oldest township in Franklin County is Chateauguay, which was founded in 1799. The youngest township is Tupper Lake, which was founded as Altamont.
Yes.
In 1890. So that's the youngest township. In 2004, I believe, it was renamed Tupper Lake. The village of Tupper Lake was always Tupper Lake. Now the township is also Tupper Lake. So the oldest is Chateauguay. The youngest is Tupper Lake. The town of Bangor was founded in 1812. Belmont in 1833. Bombay in 1833, so we've got kind of twins there.
Yep.
Brandon in 1828, Brighton in 1858, Burke in 1844. Although the settlements in what is now Burke predate that by a long shot, but those people consider themselves from Malone before Burke was founded. Chateauguay, like I said, in 1799. Constable in 1807, so the town of Constable celebrated its bicentennial 2 years ago. Dickinson, 1808, so Dickinson was celebrating its bicentennial as a township the same year the county was celebrating, and they did a nice job celebrating their bicentennial as well. The smallest by population township in Franklin County, the town of Duane, was founded in 1828. Fort Covington in 1817, the town of Franklin in 1836, the town of Harrietstown, which incorporates the village of Saranac Lake, well, half of the village of Saranac Lake, in 1841. Malone, which was originally named Harrison, Richard Harrison was the proprietor that owned all the land in which Malone now stands, and so it was named after him, which was common. And so it was called Harrison 1R for a long time, but then and was incorporated as such, but then was officially renamed Ezraville briefly, and then Malone. There's some indication that that the village of Malone was always referred to as Malone, but sources differ. Anyway. The town of Moira was founded in 1828, Santa Clara in 1888, Waverly in 1880, and Westville in 1829. And these towns all were kind of broken off from larger towns. You know, for example, Duane was founded in 1828 and was taken from Malone. Duane right there kind of in the middle of the county. But then when Harrietstown in the southeast of the county was founded, it was broken off from Duane. So when Duane broke off from Malone, it was much bigger, and then that in turn was broken up into smaller pieces like Duane and Harrietstown. Mm-hmm. So Duane has the least population, somewhere around 150 people in the township of Duane. The largest township in square miles is Harrietstown. The smallest township in square miles is Constable. And Malone is the most populous town, and always has been. And each of the townships in Franklin County shares in Franklin County's history, as well as has its own unique kind of part of history. Because of its topography, for example, the logging in the southern part of the county, or the high altitude and the clean air in Saranac Lake, or the farming in northern Franklin County.
We didn't want to make anybody feel bad. We wanted to mention all their towns. You said Moira. I didn't realize that Santa Clara was 1888.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, broken off and incorporated as its own, Santa Clara is a relatively young town, only 2 years before Tupper Lake, which was the last town incorporated.
I think it's absolutely essential that we talked about Scary today.
You got to get Scary in the mix.
Your eyes sparkled when you said he knows about Scary. Well, of course, Scary is a wonderful place. And actually, this is all the counties in northern New York and New York State are wonderful, but it's so great when you get inside and start peeling layers off.
That's right.
And realize who lived here, how they managed to survive, how utterly horrible and difficult life was in 1808 in this area.
That's right. Yeah, and yet freeing in a way, because we think of the out west as being the frontier and pioneers, but northern Franklin County in 1808 was the frontier, and then southern Franklin County continued to be the frontier for a long time after that. And these people, like you said, had to carve out their existence from the wilderness.
Literally.
And yet were free to do that in the way they saw fit.
Isn't it great?
And by the sweat of their own brows were able to build a life, and for some that was incredibly freeing.
And stop to think about it, what we're doing right here is another frontier. Putting all those wonderful pictures on the internet is another frontier. So there are still worlds to conquer. I want to say, as we wrap it up here today, what a great pleasure it is to meet you.
And likewise.
To find somebody who is so passionate about history and who is not afraid to perpetuate that passion by inspiring young people, little Girl Scouts.
Certainly hope so.
And old fat guys like me.
Certainly hope
and
so.
Calvin. And Worley is your maiden name, right?
Yeah.
From Central New York?
I grew up in Central New York, yes.
Yeah. Now you're back.
That's right.
We're
That's
delighted to have you here. I want to wish you the very best here at the House of History in Malone. It's always a fulfilling experience for me to come down here, because I spent a lot of time in my misspent youth all around this area, and it's always great to come back. Thank you so much for having us here.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks to all our viewers for watching this program, for tolerating the sometimes silliness that we do. But I hope you realize how important it is to study the history of the place where you live. We welcome your comments. Of course, we always welcome these large checks. If you'd write them out to Hometown Cable, send them to Calvin Castine on the Ridge Road in Champlain. And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.